Colonel James
I'd do
Whitmore
it.
picked up the radio and spoke 4 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life.
No one thought you
Fall
would come
back.
back.
We lost Carter. He did not hesitate. He did not search. He did not wait. He simply decided that one soldier was worth less than his reputation, and then he filed the paperwork to make it official. But what Colonel Whitmore did not know, what none of them knew, was that Emily Carter was still breathing, and she was already moving. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. Emily Carter had been awake for 31 hours straight by the time the mission went sideways. That was not unusual for her. She had spent 12 years learning how to function on no sleep, no food, and no support. She had learned it the hard way, the way most women in special operations learned everything, by being told over and over again that she did not belong and then being forced to prove otherwise while carrying twice the weight of everyone around her. She was 34 years old. She held the rank of captain. She had 2 commendations, 1 Purple Heart, and a reputation inside her unit for being the kind of officer who never ever panicked. Her soldiers called her Ice, not because she was cold, but because when everything around her was burning, she was the only one who stayed cool enough to think. Tonight she needed every ounce of that calm, because tonight nothing was going according to plan. The original briefing had lasted 45 minutes. Colonel James Whitmore had stood at the front of the room with his arms crossed and his jaw set the way he always stood when he wanted to remind everyone in the room who was in charge. He had walked through the satellite imagery, the projected timeline, the entry and exit coordinates, all of it delivered with the precise, clipped confidence of a man who had never once questioned his own judgment. The mission objective was Khalid Rahman, enemy commander, architect of 3 major attacks against American personnel in the past 18 months, responsible by confirmed intelligence for the deaths of 11 soldiers and 4 civilian contractors. I was operating out of a compound in the northeastern mountains. Remote, high altitude, difficult terrain, but intelligence had confirmed a narrow window, barely 6 hours when his security detail would be reduced and the compound would be accessible. We go in, we extract the target, we come home before sunrise, Whitmore had said, tapping the map with 1 finger. Simple, clean, efficient. Emily had raised her hand. What's the contingency if communications go down before extraction? Whitmore had looked at her the way he always looked at her, like she had just said something unnecessarily complicated on purpose. Communications won't go down, Carter. But if they do, they won't, he said again and moved on. She had written the question in her notebook anyway, beside a small red asterisk. She had learned a long time ago that the questions people refused to answer were always the ones that mattered most. The team inserted via helicopter at 2200 hours. 8 operators, including Emily, moving through terrain that was rocky and steep and completely unforgiving. The air was cold enough to bite through their gear. The wind was strong enough to carry sound unpredictably. Emily had flagged both of those conditions in her pre-mission assessment. Nobody had responded to her assessment. For the first 2 hours, everything moved cleanly. They reached the outer perimeter of the compound without contact. The intelligence about the reduced security detail appeared accurate. Emily found a breach point on the eastern wall and led the team through it with less than 4 minutes of exposure. And then the lights came on. Every single light in that compound blazed to life at exactly the same moment, and Emily had approximately 1 second to understand what that meant before the shooting started. She grabbed the arm of the soldier nearest to her, Sergeant Marcus Webb, 26 years old, father of a daughter he had never met, and pulled him behind a concrete barrier as the first burst of gunfire tore through the air where he had just been standing. "It's a trap," she said into her radio. "This is a setup. They knew we were coming." The response from command was immediate static. She switched frequencies. More static. She switched again. Nothing. "Radio's jammed," she called out. "We're on our own. Webb on me. Everyone else fall back to the eastern breach point. Move now." What happened in the next 11 minutes was the kind of chaos that military after-action reports would later describe in cold clinical language terms like coordinated ambush and unexpected hostile force concentration that did nothing to capture the actual human experience of being surrounded in the dark by people who very much wanted you dead. Emily moved through that chaos like she had been built for it. She did not freeze. She did not hesitate. She assessed, decided, and acted over and over in a rapid cycle that her training had made almost instinctive. She pulled two soldiers out of crossfire patterns they didn't even see forming. She identified an escape corridor along the compound's northern wall and pushed her people toward it. She provided covering fire twice from positions that exposed her to significant risk because there was no other way to keep her team moving. By the time they reached the breach point, she had accounted for 6 of the 8 team members. 2 were still unaccounted for. She turned to Webb. "I'm going back." "Captain, I'm going back. You get the rest of them to the extraction point. Do not wait for me past the window." "Understood." Webb stared at her. He was young, and he was scared, and he was also one of the most capable soldiers she had ever worked with. She saw the conflict moving across his face, the loyalty to her pulling in one direction, the order pulling in another. "That's an order, Sergeant," she said quietly. He went. She turned back toward the compound. She found the 2 missing soldiers' privates. Alvarez and Donnelly pinned behind a vehicle on the compound's western side, taking fire from 2 directions. It took her 9 minutes to reach them, and another 4 to create enough suppression fire to break the pattern and get them moving. One of them was wounded Alvarez, a bullet through the upper left arm, bleeding badly but mobile. "Come on," Emily said, holding him up with one arm, her weapon in the other hand. "We're going to the extraction point. Keep moving." "You came back for us," Alvarez said. He sounded genuinely shocked. That broke something small in Emily's chest. "Of course I came back for you," she said. "That's what we do." They were 300 meters from the extraction point when the helicopter lifted off. Emily heard the rotors before she saw the aircraft. She heard the change in pitch that told her it was not hovering, it was ascending. She heard the sound of something that was supposed to wait leaving. She keyed her radio one more time, knowing it was still jammed, trying anyway. "This is Captain Carter. We are 300 meters from extraction. We have a wounded soldier. We need 30 more seconds." 30 seconds. "Anyone copy? Static." The helicopter disappeared over the ridge. Emily stood in the dark for 1 full second, just one, and then she shifted Alvarez's weight on her shoulder and said, "We keep moving. There's a secondary rally point 2 kilometers north. We get there and we signal." She said it with absolute certainty. She had no idea if it was true. But Alvarez and Donnelly were looking at her the way people look at the one thing they still believe in when everything else has fallen apart, and Emily Carter had learned something important over 12 years of service. Sometimes the most important job of a leader had nothing to do with tactics or intelligence or combat ability. Sometimes the most important job was simply refusing to stop believing out loud. It took them 40 minutes to reach the secondary rally point. Emily used a piece of broken mirror from a discarded kit to attempt a signal flash. She used the emergency beacon twice, 30 seconds each burst. She treated Alvarez's wound with the supplies in her own kit, talking to him the whole time. Not about the mission, not about their situation, but about his daughter. What was her name? How old was she? Did she like anything yet? Any particular food or toy or sound? He told her. His voice steadied as he talked. Donnelly stood watch, scanning the darkness, and Emily worked. And for 20 minutes, the 3 of them existed in that specific kind of quiet that settles over soldiers when the immediate danger has passed and what's left is just the long work of surviving. The response to the beacon never came. What came instead was Webb's voice, faint, breaking up, reaching her through a brief gap in the jamming, saying 8 words that Emily would hear in her sleep for years afterward. "Command says fall back. We have lost Carter." She heard it clearly enough to understand every word. She heard Whitmore's voice underneath it, not the words but the tone, the finality of it, the complete absence of uncertainty. He had said it the way people say things they have already decided are true, and Emily understood in that moment that she was not lost to Whitmore. She was disposed of. There was a difference. Being lost meant someone was still looking. Being disposed of meant someone had decided the math didn't work out in her favor. She took one long breath, then another. Then she looked at Alvarez and Donnelly and made the hardest decision of the night. "I'm going to walk you to the outer perimeter road," she said. "Once you're there, you follow it northeast for 4 kilometers. You'll hit a village. The village elder is named Farouk. We have a prior relationship with him. Tell him Emily sent you. He'll shelter you and get word to friendly forces. Can you do that?" Donnelly looked at her. "What are you going to do?" Emily was quiet for a moment. "There's information back at that compound," she said. "Something I saw during the approach documents, equipment positioning. Rahman isn't running. He's staying because he has something planned. Something big. Captain, you can't go back in there alone." "I'm not going back in," she said. "I'm going forward." She paused. "Command thinks I'm dead, which means nobody is expecting me, which means for the next few hours I might be the most dangerous person in this entire region, because I'm the only one who can move without anyone knowing I exist." Alvarez was watching her with an expression that was part admiration and part something that looked very much like fear. "You're serious," he said. "Go to Faruqa," she said. "Get word out. And when you talk to the people who made that call tonight," she stopped. She thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about Whitmore's voice and the 4 words in the helicopter lifting off while she was still 300 meters away. She thought about 12 years of being underestimated and overlooked and judged before she ever had a chance to prove what she was worth. She decided against anger. Anger was expensive and she needed every ounce of energy for what came next. "Tell them I'm finishing the mission," she said simply. She walked them to the road. She watched them go. She stood in the dark long enough to be sure they were moving in the right direction. Then she turned back toward the mountains, back toward the compound, back toward the man everyone had spent months trying to capture. The woman command had just declared dead. She started walking. Inside the command post, 40 kilometers from where Emily Carter was moving through darkness, Colonel James Whitmore was writing his report. He worked efficiently. He always did. The sentences came out clean and precise the way he had written hundreds of reports over a 20-year career, structured, factual, free of anything that might require additional explanation. He described the mission. He described the ambush. He listed the casualties. He documented the decision to extract the remaining team members due to hostile conditions and communication failure. He wrote Emily Carter's name under the heading, "Fallen in action, body not recovered." Then he set down his pen and stared at the wall for a moment. Major Dennis Hargrove, his executive officer, sat across the room. Hargrove was 38, careful and smart in the particular way of people who survived by knowing which questions to ask and which ones to leave alone. He had been quiet since the team returned. He had been looking at the floor a lot. "The beacon fired twice," Hargrove said. Whitmore did not look up. "The jamming was still active." "The jamming was confirmed cleared by 0117. The beacon fired at 0122 and U124. Whitmore was quiet. "Sir," Hargrove said, "that's after the window closed. That's 5 minutes after we extracted. Someone was alive in that sector at 0122. Whitmore picked his pen back up. "The environment is chaotic," he said. "Equipment can fire on its own after..." With a deliberate 2-minute pause between pulses, Hargrove said, "That's not equipment malfunctioning, sir. That's someone following protocol." Whitmore finally looked up. And something happened in that look, something Hargrove would not forget, because it was not the expression of a man who was uncertain or conflicted or struggling with a difficult decision. It was the expression of a man who had already made his choice and was now being inconvenienced by the evidence. "The mission is over, Dennis," he said. "The report stands." Hargrove said nothing else, but he made a copy of the beacon log before the night was over. He told himself he didn't know why. He kept it anyway. In the mountains, Emily found a place to rest for 3 hours. Not because she wanted to, but because she understood her body the way an engineer understands a machine. She knew its tolerances, its limits, the specific cost of pushing past them when she still had days ahead of her. She needed the 3 hours. So she took them wedged into a rocky overhang above the tree line, with the wind howling past her and her injured leg throbbing and her mind moving through everything she had seen in those final moments inside the compound. She had been trained as a combat intelligence officer. Her job on any given mission was not just to shoot and move and communicate, it was to see, to absorb detail in chaotic environments and extract meaning from it, to look at what was present and what was absent and understand what the difference meant. In those last moments before the extraction, running through the compound with Alvarez's weight on her shoulder and bullets finding the walls around her, she had seen something that she was not supposed to see. A communication setup, new equipment, satellite uplink, maps on the walls that didn't match the region's known infrastructure maps, that showed movement in corridors, assembly points, timing markers. Rahman was not in hiding. He was in command. and whatever he was commanding was not small. She lay in the overhang and let herself absorb that for a full 30 seconds. Let it settle into the part of her mind that did not panic. Then she began to think. She had no radio that worked. She had partial supplies enough for perhaps 4 days of careful rationing. She had her sidearm, 2 magazines and a blade. She had injuries that would slow her but not stop her. She had the terrain familiar enough from the pre-mission study to navigate hostile enough to be a threat. And she had something that nobody at that command post had accounted for. She had time. Because as far as Rahman was concerned, the American mission was over. As far as he knew, the soldiers were gone, the operation had failed, and whatever he was planning could proceed without interference. He was not looking for her. Nobody was looking for her. That meant she could move freely through a space where no one expected a threat to exist. And in combat intelligence, there was no more valuable position than the one nobody knew was occupied. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 hours. Then she got up, checked her equipment, adjusted her pack on her shoulders, and began moving toward the coordinates she had memorized from those maps on the compound wall. She moved alone in the dark through mountains that wanted to kill her. She had been in worse situations. She was trying to think of one. She almost could. What she kept coming back to through the cold, through the pain, through the long, grinding hours of movement, was the look on Alvarez's face when she had come back for him. "You came back for us." He had sounded so surprised. She thought about that, about what it meant that a soldier could be surprised, genuinely, viscerally surprised that an officer had returned for them. About what that said about the environment they were operating in, about what it said about the decisions being made by the people who were supposed to be leading them. "You came back for us," as if it were an unusual thing, as if it were something beyond expectation. She moved through the dark and thought about that, and somewhere in the thinking she found something she hadn't expected to find in a night that had taken almost everything from her. She found fuel, not anger, not bitterness, not the hot, corrosive kind of emotion that burns people out in situations like this. Something colder and more sustaining. A sense of purpose, so clear it was almost like a physical sensation, a weight in her chest that told her exactly why she was still moving, exactly why she was still here, exactly what the next 24 hours were supposed to mean. She was still here because soldiers like Alvarez deserved officers who came back. She was still moving because Khalid Rahman had not been stopped yet. She was alone in these mountains because one man had decided her life was worth less than the inconvenience of her survival. And she was going to complete this mission, not to prove him wrong, though she would, and not to earn recognition, though she wouldn't ask for it. She was going to complete this mission because it was the mission, because that was who she was. Because in 12 years of service, through every test and obstacle and person who had looked at her and decided she didn't belong, the one thing Emily Carter had never once been willing to do was walk away from the people who needed her to stay. She kept walking. The mountains pressed in on every side. The cold was relentless. Her leg hurt in a way that suggested she would be paying for this for months, maybe longer. She kept walking. Somewhere ahead, in a fortress carved into the rock, a man named Khalid Rahman was planning an attack that could cost dozens of lives. He was operating on the assumption that the threat against him had been neutralized. He was making plans without checking behind him. He had no idea what was already in motion. I had no idea that the one person on Earth who knew exactly where he was and exactly what he was planning and had absolutely nothing left to lose was already moving through the dark toward him, alone, decided, and about to do something that everyone who knew her would eventually say was impossible. Everyone except Emily Carter. Because Emily Carter had learned in the hardest school there was that impossible was just a word people used when they hadn't met the right person yet. And she was very much the right person. She moved through the night, and the mountains held their breath. Day 2, or 400 hours. She had been moving for 6 hours without stopping when her left leg finally gave out. Not completely. Not the way legs give out in movies. No dramatic collapse. No falling to the ground in slow motion. It was more like a quiet negotiation between her body and her brain, a sudden refusal by the muscles below her knee to cooperate any further without a direct conversation about what was being asked of them. Emily went down on one knee, caught herself on a rock face with her right hand, and stayed there for exactly 45 seconds. She counted. She always counted, when her body tried to stop her because counting gave her mind something to do other than listen to the argument her body was making. 45 seconds. Then she stood back up. She had wrapped the leg 3 hours ago using a strip of fabric torn from the inside lining of her pack. The wrapping was tight enough to provide some stability, but not so tight that it cut circulation. She had done it in the dark by feel alone, and she had done it correctly because there was no option in which she had done it incorrectly. She kept moving. The compound she was heading toward was approximately 11 kilometers from the secondary rally point where she had left Alvarez and Donnelly. 11 kilometers on flat terrain would have taken her roughly 2.5 hours. In these mountains on this leg, in this darkness, with this wind, she was estimating 6 to 8 hours. She had stopped estimating things that depended on conditions she could not control and started estimating only the things she could. Her water supply would last 12 hours if she rationed carefully. She had 4 protein bars, a small amount of dried fruit from an emergency pouch, and a single package of electrolyte powder she was saving for the moment. She genuinely could not take another step without it. She cataloged these things not with fear, but with the quiet precision of someone who understands that survival is just a math problem, a complicated one, but still a math problem, and math problems have solutions if you work them carefully enough. What she did not let herself catalog was everything else. The fact that no one was coming for her, the fact that she had heard her own name declared dead. The fact that the man responsible for that declaration was sitting in a warm room 40 kilometers away, writing a report that would bury the truth about what had happened tonight under layers of procedural language and careful omission. She did not let herself go to those places because those places were expensive. Anger cost energy, grief cost focus. And she needed both of those things for what was ahead of her, so she walked and she breathed and she thought only about the next step. And then the one after that, and the one after that. At 051 Unseen, she heard something that stopped her cold. Voices, 2 of them carrying on the wind from somewhere above and to her left. Conversational, not alarmed, the specific cadence of people who believed they were alone and therefore had no reason to lower their voices. Emily stopped moving immediately. She pressed herself against the rock face and held perfectly still and listened. She could not hear the words clearly. The wind was doing too much work, but she could hear the pattern. 2 men, one spoke more than the other. The one who spoke less laughed twice, a short dry sound, and then said something that made the other one go quiet for a moment before responding. She had her hand on her sidearm. She did not draw it. Drawing meant committing to an action she might not need to take, and every round she used unnecessarily was a round she would not have for the moments that actually required it. She held still and waited and assessed and let herself do what she did best. She listened. Gradually, as the wind shifted, she began to catch fragments. Not enough to fully translate, her Pashto was functional, but not fluent, but enough to understand the general shape of what was being said. They were on patrol. This was a scheduled route. One of them was complaining about the cold. The other one was responding with something that sounded like an agreement, followed by an estimate of time, how long until they could return to the compound. Not a search patrol, a routine patrol, which meant they were not looking for her, which meant they had not been told to look for her, which meant that as far as everyone in that fortress was concerned, the night's events had concluded in a predictable way. The Americans had attempted something and failed, and now the world had returned to its normal order. Emily stayed still for 6 full minutes after the voices faded. Then she changed her route by 40 degrees, moving lower on the slope and farther west, adding distance but eliminating the risk of crossing the patrol line. She did not second-guess the decision. She simply made it and moved. That was another thing 12 years had taught her. In the field, a decision made and committed to was almost always better than the perfect decision made too late. By 0700, the sky was beginning to change at the edges. Not light yet, not truly, but the quality of the darkness was shifting, thinning at the horizon like something being slowly diluted. Dawn was coming, and with dawn came visibility, which meant she needed to be in cover before it arrived. She had marked on the mental map she had been building from the compound documents. She had seen a position that should work. A cluster of geological features on the eastern face of the next ridge, the kind of formation that created natural shelter and natural concealment simultaneously. She had no guarantee the mental map was accurate. She was working from a 4-second visual of documents she had scanned in chaotic circumstances under fire, while simultaneously managing a wounded soldier and monitoring 3 different threat vectors. But her memory was one of the things people consistently underestimated about her. Colonel Whitmore in particular had never once commented on her memory. He had commented on her caution, her analytical style, her tendency to raise questions in briefings that he found inconvenient. He had never acknowledged that the reason she raised those questions was because she retained information at a level that most people in those briefings did not. She found the rock formation at 0648, 12 minutes before dawn broke fully. She settled into the deepest part of the shelter, checked her leg, drank a controlled amount of water, and let herself sit for a moment with the reality of where she was. She was alone in enemy-controlled mountains, declared dead by her own command, tracking a high-value target without support communication or extraction plan. She had a partial injury, limited supplies, and a window of opportunity that would close the moment Rahman moved from his current position. She also had something that very few people in this situation would have. She had the advantage of being unknown. Rahman thought the threat against him had been neutralized. His security was running on the assumption of success, the assumption that the Americans had retreated, that the danger had passed, that he could now move forward with whatever he was planning. He was comfortable, and comfortable enemies made mistakes. She let herself sleep for 2 hours, not because she had the luxury of it, but because she understood with the same clinical precision she applied to everything that 2 hours of sleep now would be worth 6 hours of alertness later. She set an internal alarm the way she had trained herself to do years ago, and she was awake at exactly 0857, sharp and oriented with the clarity that only comes from the specific combination of exhaustion and necessity. She spent the next 3 hours observing. This was something people who didn't do her work rarely understood, how much of intelligence collection was simply watching. Watching and recording and resisting the impulse to interpret too quickly to assign meaning before you had enough data to support it. She watched the movement patterns at the compound from her elevated position. She counted figures. She tracked timing. She noted which positions stayed constant and which rotated. She mapped on a small piece of torn paper from her kit the approximate positions of the security detail at each observation point. She was building a picture, and the picture that was building was telling her something very specific. They were preparing for something. Not a response to last night's events. The activity level was too organized, too purposeful for reactive behavior. This was preparation, logistics movement, equipment staging, the kind of controlled, systematic activity that preceded an operation. Rahman was not staying because he felt safe. Rahman was staying because he was almost ready. The question was, ready for what? And then just after 1100 hours, she got her answer. A vehicle arrived at the compound's northern entrance. She tracked it carefully, a covered truck moving without haste, followed by 2 smaller vehicles maintaining a loose escort formation, not a supply run. The escort configuration was wrong for supply. It was the right configuration for personnel transport, specifically for the transport of someone important. She watched the vehicles stop, watched the doors open, watched the figures emerge. One of them moved differently from the others, not in a way that most people would notice, but in a way that Emily noticed immediately. He moved like someone who was used to having space cleared for him, used to other people adjusting their positions in relation to his used to being the fixed point around which everything else orbited. She could not see his face from this distance. But she had spent months studying Khalid Rahman's intelligence file, and one of the things in that file was a behavioral assessment, how he moved, how he carried himself, the specific way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, a legacy of an old injury that had never properly healed. That left shoulder, she could see it clearly even at this distance, and her entire strategic calculations shifted in a single moment. She had been planning to gather intelligence and find a way to relay it to friendly forces. She had been operating under the assumption that she was ultimately a collection asset, that her role was to see and record and survive long enough to transmit what she had seen. But what she was looking at right now changed the math entirely, because she was not looking at evidence of Rahman's plans. She was looking at Rahman. I was here. He was present. He was accessible, not comfortably, not without significant risk, but accessible in a way he had not been in months of effort by her entire unit. She thought about Alvarez's wound. She thought about the 11 soldiers and 4 contractors whose names were in that intelligence file. She thought about the maps on that compound wall, the movement corridors, the assembly points, the timing markers. She thought about what would happen if that attack proceeded. She thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she put the piece of torn paper with her observation notes into her boot, checked her sidearm, checked her blade, and began working out an approach route. She was going in. Not tonight, not yet. The next 12 hours were about preparation, about moving into position, about understanding every inch of the approach, about being so certain of her plan that when the moment came, there would be no hesitation. But she was going in. The decision settled into her with a kind of absolute calm that she recognized. She had felt it before at critical moments, not fearlessness, but something more useful than fearlessness. Clarity. The specific, quiet certainty of someone who has reduced their options down to one and is now completely committed to making that one option work. While Emily Carter was setting her approach from the mountainside, Colonel James Whitmore was having a conversation he had not expected to have. It was now just past 1400 hours at the forward operating base. The initial chaos of the previous night had settled into the particular grim quiet that follows bad operations, people moving a little more carefully, speaking a little more precisely aware that what they said and did now would eventually be examined. Major Hargrove knocked on Whitmore's door frame at 1412 and came in without waiting for an answer, which was unusual enough to make Whitmore look up from his desk immediately. "We have a problem," Hargrove said. "We have several," Whitmore said. "Which one are you referring to?" Alvarez and Donnelly made it out. Whitmore went still. "What? They came in through the northeastern sector an hour ago. They were sheltered by a local asset overnight. Someone named Farouk, the village elder in the northeastern region. They both have the same account of what happened." Whitmore set down his pen slowly. "What account?" Hargrove looked at him with the expression of a man who had been deciding something for the past several hours and had finally made up his mind. "They said Carter came back for them," he said, "after the order to extract, after the helicopter left. They said she came back into the compound and got them out. And then he paused. She sent them to Farouk, and she went back toward the compound." The room was very quiet. "She's alive," Hargrove said. "Sir Carter is alive, and she's still in the field." Whitmore's face went through several things in quick succession. Hargrove watched all of them happen, and what he noticed, what he would remember for a very long time, was that relief was not one of them. "Their account could reflect confusion," Whitmore said carefully. "It was a high-stress environment. Soldiers misremember." "Both of them said the same thing independently," Hargrove said. "Before they were debriefed together, before they could have coordinated. Sir, they both said the same words." He paused. "Tell them I'm finishing the mission." The silence stretched. "She's alone out there," Hargrove said. "If we deploy a search and recovery—" "The report has already been submitted," Whitmore said. "Then we file an addendum. To say what Major—" Whitmore's voice sharpened. "To say that we extracted prematurely, to say that we left an officer in the field and then marked her as a casualty before confirming." He stood up and Hargrove noticed that his hands flat on the desk were pressing down hard. "That report reflects the information available at the time. Carter's status was unknown. The decision to extract was made under hostile conditions with impaired communications. And now her status is known," Hargrove said. "She's alive. We have 2 eyewitnesses, and she is alone in enemy-controlled territory, completing a mission that we walked away from." Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. "I'll review the situation and determine the appropriate response," he said. "That's all, Major." Hargrove didn't move. "With respect, sir," he said quietly, "if something happens to her out there, if she doesn't come back and it comes out that we knew she was alive and didn't mount a recovery effort." "I said that's all, Major." Hargrove looked at him for 2 full seconds. Then he turned and walked out. In the hallway he stopped, leaned against the wall, and exhaled slowly. He was thinking about 2 things simultaneously. He was thinking about the beacon log copy he had made the night before, and he was thinking about the look on Whitmore's face just now, that specific absence of relief. He took out his phone. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he made a call that was not to anyone in his chain of command. Back in the mountains, as the afternoon light changed the color of the rocks around her, Emily was executing something that had no official name in any military manual, but that she privately called controlled patience. It meant moving slowly. It meant stopping completely when she needed to stop. It meant accepting the frustrating pace of true stalking work, kind of movement that felt like it was barely movement at all, that felt like every instinct in your body was being suppressed in service of a goal that required you to be invisible rather than fast. She had identified her approach route. She had timed the patrol rotation 3 times, checking her estimates against each cycle to build a reliable average. She had located the position she needed to reach before nightfall, a structure on the compound's eastern side that appeared from her observation to be used for equipment storage. Low activity, single access point. Positioned in a patrol shadow, a gap in the coverage created by the intersection of 2 separate patrol routes that left a 4-minute window every 40 minutes. 4 minutes, that was what she was working with. She thought about the people who had spent months building intelligence on Rahman, running operations, assembling teams, writing plans. She thought about the resources deployed, the risk taken, the cost paid. She thought about Whitmore in his warm room, writing his report, deciding what the math said about one soldier's life. She thought about Alvarez saying, "You came back for us," like it was the most surprising thing that had ever happened to him. She moved into her staging position at 17:30 hours, 3 hours until dark. She rationed another portion of water. She checked her weapon. She breathed. She thought about what she was going to do when she got in there. Not in a fearful way. She was past fear right now, past the place where fear had any useful function. She thought about it the way she thought about all hard problems, methodically from first principles, one step at a time. Get to the storage structure. Assess the interior layout. Identify where Rahman would most likely be housed within the compound. Move into position. Wait for the right moment. One shot, not literal but strategic. One moment when everything aligned. She would not get a second chance. She knew that. And somehow knowing it made her calmer. At 18:43, something happened that she had not planned for. She heard a sound from behind her. Not a large sound, not a sound of alarm or pursuit. A small sound, the specific kind that humans make when they are trying not to make sounds and not quite succeeding. A careful footstep. A controlled breath. Emily turned slowly, her hand on her weapon. She found herself looking at a boy who could not have been more than 15 years old. He was dressed in the kind of layered, practical clothing that people in these mountains wore as a matter of survival, not style. His eyes were very wide. His hands were raised, both of them at about shoulder height. Not a gesture he had been trained to make, but the instinctive, universal human gesture that meant, "Please don't shoot me." Emily held still. The boy said something in Pashto. She caught 2 words out of the rapid stream, American and help. She kept her hand on her weapon, but did not draw it. "Slowly," she said. In English, first then the Pashto equivalent. "Slowly, who are you?" He said his name. He said it twice quickly, as if repetition would make it more convincing. Then he said something longer, a sentence she had to work through, carefully catching words she knew and building context around the ones she didn't. He had seen her come down the mountain. He had been watching from above. He knew who she was, not by name, but by category. American soldier, female, alone. He had been debating with himself for hours about whether to approach. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said a name. It was a name she recognized immediately. It was the name of a village elder she had worked with on a previous deployment. A man who had provided shelter to American personnel whose information had been reliable, who was known inside her unit as a trusted contact. The boy said the name and then touched his own chest. His uncle. She studied him for 3 full seconds, reading everything she could from his posture, his expression, the consistency of his story with what she knew about the region's networks. Either he was genuine or she was about to make the last mistake of her life. "Okay," she said slowly. "Okay, tell me what you know." What the boy told her over the next 40 minutes changed everything. He had been inside that compound. Not as a fighter, he was emphatic about that, emphatic in the way teenagers are emphatic, with a kind of urgent sincerity that was difficult to manufacture. He had been inside as a worker. His family had been coerced into providing labor for Rahman's operation, not given a choice, not compensated, simply told. And while he had been working, he had seen things. He described the communications equipment she had already noted. He described the maps. But then he described something she had not seen, a room she had not reached in those chaotic 4 seconds of visual intelligence gathering. A room with additional personnel, people who had arrived not as fighters but as planners. People with documents and equipment in a specific kind of focused intensity that even a 15-year-old could recognize as something more than ordinary. And then he told her the timing. The operation was planned for 72 hours from now. Not days away, not weeks, 72 hours. The people in that room with their documents and their intensity were finalizing the last details of something that had been months in the making, and in 3 days it would move from planning into execution. Emily sat with this information and felt it settle into her understanding of the situation like a stone dropping into still water. The ripples moving outward, touching everything, changing the shape of what she had thought she knew. She had been thinking about a capture operation, about intelligence collection, about completing the mission that had been assigned. But what the boy was describing was not a mission objective, it was a countdown. "Can you get me inside?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. He was a teenager, he was frightened. He was doing something tonight that most adults would not have done out of a courage that came not from training or experience, but from a 15-year-old's uncomplicated understanding of what was right and what was wrong. He nodded. Emily looked at him and felt something she did not often allow herself to feel in the field. She felt it anyway. "What's your name?" she asked. He told her. "Okay," she said. "Here's what we're going to do." She laid out the plan. She kept it simple, not because she thought he wasn't capable of understanding complexity, but because simple plans were the only plans that survived contact with reality. He listened. He asked one question, and it was a smart question, the kind of question that told her he had been paying attention to the right things. She answered it honestly. Then she looked at him with the direct, steady gaze that her soldiers always said made them feel like she could see straight through to the part of them that actually knew what to do. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I mean that. Whatever happens after tonight, you've already done something that matters. You came to me. You told me what you know. That already matters. If you walk away right now, I will not think less of you." He shook his head immediately before she had even finished the sentence. "Rahman hurt my family," he said in Pashto. Simply, without drama. She understood every word. "Okay," she said, "then let's go." The night was fully dark now. The patrol rotation was predictable. The 4-minute window was approaching. Emily Carter and a 15-year-old boy who was braver than he had any right to be moved together toward the compound. And the fortress that Khalid Rahman believed was impenetrable began to receive a visitor he did not know was coming. The boy moved like someone who had learned silence the hard way. Emily noticed that immediately. He did not have military training. His posture was wrong for that. His breathing pattern was wrong for that. But he had something that training sometimes failed to produce. He had the specific bone-deep awareness of someone who had survived by being invisible, who had learned that the cost of being noticed was too high to pay. She followed him through the 4-minute window in the patrol rotation with 11 seconds to spare. 11 seconds. She did not let herself think about what 8 seconds fewer would have meant. She was inside now. The thinking that mattered was forward thinking. The storage structure was exactly where her observation had placed it. The boy led her to it without hesitation, moving along the compound's interior wall with the practiced ease of someone who had walked this route before. He stopped at a low door, pressed himself flat against the wall beside it, and looked at her. She listened for 15 seconds. No movement from inside, no voices. She tried the door. It opened. They went in. The interior was dark and smelled of oil and metal, and something else, something chemical, sharp in particular, that Emily identified in the first breath and felt move through her like an electric current. Explosive compound. Recent. Not stored, used recently and recently replenished. She did not say it out loud. She filed it and moved. "Where does Rahman sleep?" she asked the boy. Quiet, almost no voice at all. He held up one finger. One floor up. He pointed to the north side of the compound. "How many guards outside the door?" He held up 2 fingers. Then he hesitated and added a third. 3, she confirmed. He nodded. "Where does he meet with the planners?" He pointed down through the floor lower level. Then he made a gesture she interpreted as a large room, open space, many people. She thought for a moment. The planners would be the intelligence priority. But Rahman himself was the mission objective, the person whose capture would disrupt not just this operation, but the entire network that sustained it. She needed to know which location she was choosing before she moved, because in a space like this, with the numbers she was working against, she would not have the option of changing her mind once she started. The lower room, she said. How many people? He showed her 7 fingers. Then he closed his fist and opened it again. More. Maybe more than that. She absorbed this without changing her expression because the boy was watching her face for permission to be afraid, and she could not give him that permission yet. I need to know one more thing, she said. The attack they're planning. 72 hours from now. Do you know the target? The boy's expression shifted. Something crossed his face that was part fear and part a deep-settled anger, the kind of anger that does not burn hot but sits heavy, the kind that belongs to people who have been wronged at a level that cannot be undone, he told her. And Emily Carter, who had trained herself not to react visibly to information, regardless of its content, felt the air go out of her lungs for one full second. It was a civilian target, not a military installation, not a forward operating base, not a convoy route. A market, a civilian market in a regional city on a day when it would be at maximum density. The intelligence he described, the timing, the method, the scale pointed toward a casualty number that made everything she had already sacrificed tonight feel suddenly completely insufficient. This was not a mission anymore. This was a race. Okay, she said quietly. She looked at the boy. Okay, I need you to leave now. He started to protest. Listen to me, she said, and she put one hand on his shoulder the way she would have with any young soldier who was about to argue with a direct order. You have already done something tonight that most grown men would not have done. You got me inside. That is what I needed. Now I need you to be somewhere else when things get loud. He looked at her for a long moment. You are one person, he said. Yes, she agreed, and there are many of them. Also yes. He searched her face for something. She wasn't sure what he was looking for. Whatever it was, she hoped he found it because she couldn't manufacture reassurance she didn't have. Go to Farouk, she said. My soldiers went to Farouk. Tell him everything you told me. Tell him Captain Carter is inside and needs extraction in, she thought quickly, 6 hours. Tell him 6 hours. Can you do that? He nodded. Then he said something she did not entirely catch, but the last word was clear. The last word was courage. She watched him go. Then she turned back toward the compound alone again and felt the familiar weight of that settle over her. Not crushing, but real. A physical sensation she had stopped trying to describe to people who had not felt it. It felt like standing at the top of something very high and choosing to jump. Day 2, 2209 hours. The lower level was accessed by a staircase on the compound's interior northern wall. Emily identified it from the structural layout. The way the building's weight distribution told her where the load-bearing elements were, where the interior spaces would logically fall. She had spent 2 years early in her career attached to a unit that did a lot of work in built environments, and that time had given her a way of reading buildings that was almost instinctive now. She moved through the compound's interior with a patience that cost her everything she had. Fast was not an option. Fast would get her killed and Rahman would complete his countdown, and a market full of civilians would bear the cost of her impatience. So she moved slowly and she breathed steadily, and she used every second of every patrol gap she had already timed and memorized. She reached the staircase at 2221. She went down. The lower level was warmer than the upper compound body heat from multiple people in an enclosed space, a detail that confirmed the boy's intelligence about the number of people in that room. She could hear voices now, not individual words yet, but the rhythm of organized discussion. Multiple speakers, the periodic pause of someone being listened to, the quality of a meeting in its later stages when the decisions have mostly been made and what's left is confirmation and coordination. They were almost done planning, which meant she was almost out of time. She moved along the corridor toward the sound, and she was 3 meters from the doorway when she heard something that stopped her completely. A voice she recognized, not Rahman, someone else, an accent she had heard before, not in this country, not in this region, an accent that belonged somewhere entirely different, and whose presence here was a piece of intelligence so significant that she physically stopped moving for 2 full seconds just to let it register. She filed it, she moved. At the doorway, she positioned herself against the wall and used the angle of the light from inside to assess the room without entering it. Shadows told her the rough positions of people inside. She counted, she estimated, she built her picture. 7 people visible from this angle. Rahman would be the additional element she could not see from here. Possibly more. She needed to draw him out. She needed to create a situation in which he would move, would come toward her rather than requiring her to go through 7 other people to reach him. She thought about it for 43 seconds, which was approximately 40 seconds longer than she normally allowed herself for tactical decisions. But this decision carried a specific kind of consequence, and she wanted to be certain. Then she knocked on the doorframe 3 times. Deliberate, unhurried, the knock of someone who belonged there. The voices inside stopped. She heard movement, heard the particular silence of people looking at each other, asking without words who that was. Then a voice commanding clear in Pashto asked who was there. She didn't answer. A longer silence. Then footsteps. One set, moving toward the door. She pressed herself flat and waited, and when the figure appeared in the doorway, she was already behind him, her forearm across his windpipe, her other hand at his temple, and she said into his ear, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Don't." Just that one word. He went completely still. She turned him so she could see his face and he could see hers, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the narrow corridor of a mountain fortress in the dark hours before whatever had been planned for those civilians was supposed to begin. Khalid Rahman was not what she had expected. She had spent so long studying his file, building a mental model of a man from photographs, in behavioral assessments, in third-hand accounts, that she had somehow constructed something larger. Something more impressive in the terrible way that very dangerous things are impressive. And it was an ordinary-looking man in his early 50s. Average height, his left shoulder was higher than his right, exactly as the file had said. His eyes were sharp and dark and completely, utterly calm, which was, she thought, the most genuinely frightening thing about him. He was not afraid. He was calculating. "You," he said, in English, clear and deliberate. "You are the one from last night." "Yes," she said. "They said you were dead." They were wrong. Something moved across his face, not fear, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of a miscalculation. The specific discomfort of a man who had built an entire plan on a set of assumptions and who was now understanding that one of those assumptions had been incorrect. "You came here alone," he said. She said nothing. "That is not rational," he said. "Coming alone, against this many people, that is not a rational decision." "You were the mission," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment. "What is your name?" he asked. "Captain Emily Carter, U.S. Army." He repeated it slowly as if testing the weight of it. "Captain Carter," he said, "you understand that I have many men in that room. You understand that what you are attempting is finished," she said. "What I'm attempting is finished. You're coming with me." A pause. "And if I call out," he said, "then people die in this corridor," she said, "starting with you." Another pause. "You would not survive." "No," she agreed immediately. "Probably not. Is that supposed to change something for me? Because I want to be honest with you. I was declared dead 18 hours ago by my own commanding officer. My survival at this point is genuinely not the highest item on my priority list." She paused. "Yours should be a different calculation." He looked at her and she watched him think. Rahman was not a man who had survived and risen by being reckless. He was a man who had survived and risen by being ruthlessly practical, by understanding in every situation where the real leverage lay and how to apply it. He was understanding that right now. I was understanding that the woman holding him in this corridor was not afraid to die, which meant that fear was not a lever she was susceptible to. He was understanding that calling out would produce an immediate violent response that he would not survive. He was understanding that there was a version of the situation in which he walked out of this compound alive and another version in which he did not. She could see all of that moving through him. "Where would you take me?" he said. "To people who have questions," she said. "People who've been trying to ask you questions for a very long time. And my men, the operation is over," she said. "Whatever you planned for 72 hours from now is over. That market is going to be standing in 3 days. Those people are going to be alive." She said it with a certainty she did not entirely feel, but she said it the way she said everything that needed to be true, with the full weight of her conviction behind it, because conviction had to lead sometimes when certainty was not available. Something shifted in his expression. Not surrender, not yet, but the beginning of the calculation that ended in surrender. You are a remarkable woman, he said, not as a compliment, as an observation. Walk, she said. Day 3, 0 hours. Getting out was harder than getting in. She had known it would be. Entry is always cleaner than exit, especially when you're bringing something with you that you didn't have when you arrived. The compound was now carrying the specific tension of a place where something has changed, where the meeting ended and someone didn't come back to the room, where questions are beginning to form in the minds of people who are trained to be suspicious. She moved Rahman through the compound with her hand on his arm and her sidearm pressed against his side, and she did it with the specific quality of control she had spent years developing, firm enough to be absolute, quiet enough to be invisible. He cooperated, not because he had surrendered. She understood that. He was cooperating because he was continuing to calculate, because he was a man who had learned that survival required flexibility, and because he had decided that the version of the next hour in which he was alive was preferable to the alternative. She was fine with that. Cooperation motivated by self-interest was still cooperation. She reached the storage structure at 0041. 7 minutes of movement through the interior. She had expected 4. The extra 3 were a consequence of adjusting for a patrol that came through a full 2 minutes ahead of its established rotation. Either a coincidence or the first sign that someone had noticed the absence at the center of that lower-level meeting. She pressed herself and Rahman against the wall and did not breathe for 90 seconds while the patrol passed. He did not make a sound. She filed that observation carefully. The storage structure gave her a moment to reassess. She needed to cross the compound yard and reach the breach point in the eastern wall. 80 meters of open space, patrolled coverage on both sides. One gap approximately 3 minutes wide that she had identified in her original observation, but had not timed from inside the compound. The timing from inside might be different, she looked at Rahman. When the patrol on the eastern wall reaches the corner, she said very quietly, how long before the next one arrives at the same position? He said nothing. Rahman. 4 minutes, he said, sometimes 3.5. She looked at him steadily. Is that accurate? Yes, he said. And then after a pause, I do not want to die in this yard. She believed him. At 0058, she saw the patrol reach the eastern corner and turn. She moved. 80 meters. Rahman in front of her, her hand on his collar, moving at the specific pace that is faster than walking and slower than anything that looks like running, the pace that does not draw the eye in the dark, that does not produce the silhouette of flight that covers ground while producing the least possible alarm. She reached the breach point at the 3-minute 40-second mark. She pushed Rahman through first. She went through after him. And on the other side of that wall, she stopped and took one breath and then another, and she felt a specific physical release of leaving an enclosed threat environment, the way the body exhales everything it has been holding since the moment it entered. She gave herself 3 seconds of that, 3 seconds. Then she grabbed Rahman's arm and started moving up the slope toward the ridgeline where she had spent the day observing. She was out. She had him. Now she needed to figure out what to do next. Day 3, 031 hours, 3 hours of movement through the mountains with a prisoner and a compromised leg, and the growing certainty that the compound behind her had discovered the situation by now. She had been moving as fast as the terrain and her body allowed. Rahman kept pace without resistance, still calculating, still deciding, and apparently still landing on cooperation as his best option. She had zippered his wrist with a restraint from her kit, and she kept one hand on that restraint as they moved, feeling every shift in his body's intention. He hadn't tried anything. She didn't trust that. At 0312, she found the elevated position she had identified 2 days ago, a natural hollow in the rock formation on the ridge's eastern face, deep enough to provide concealment, positioned well enough to provide sight lines in 3 directions. She put Rahman in the deepest part of it and took the position closest to the approach. Sit, she said. Don't talk unless I ask you something. He sat. He looked at her with those calm, calculating eyes. You are waiting for rescue, he said. I told you not to talk. You told the boy 6 hours, he said. That was approximately 2 hours ago. You are waiting for 4 more hours. She looked at him steadily. And you're wondering, he continued, whether the message actually reached anyone, Whether the boy made it to Farouk, whether Farouk made contact with your forces, whether your forces will respond at all given that they have already declared you dead and may not have changed that assessment. Every word of that was accurate. She said nothing. You are also wondering, he said more quietly, what happens if they don't come? She looked at him for a long moment. What I'm wondering, and she said finally, is whether you actually believe the things you've done are defensible. Whether there's a version of this story you tell yourself where what happened to those 11 soldiers and 4 contractors, where what was going to happen to that market, whether any of that is something you can actually justify to yourself in the dark. He was quiet. Because I've spent months studying you, she said, and I can't find it. I can't find the place where you stop being a man making choices and start being something else, which means the choices are yours, which means the accounting is yours. The silence stretched between them. You are trying to destabilize me, he said. No, she said simply. I already have you. I don't need to destabilize you. I'm just telling you what I think. A pause. I don't get to do that very often in this job. He looked at her with something that was almost something human. What do you think happens now? He asked. I think you get turned over to people who will ask you questions for a very long time, she said. I think the operation you planned is disrupted. I think the network you built takes a significant hit. And I think somewhere eventually the people you were planning to hurt get to keep being alive. She paused. That's what I think happens, and I think it's enough. He stared at her. You are not what I expected, he said. Nobody ever is, she said. Then she stopped the conversation because she heard something. Movement. On the slope below, more than one person, moving with purpose. She had her weapon up before the thought was complete, her body between Rahman and the approach, her finger outside the trigger guard, but her hand completely ready. The figures came up the slope and into the hollow, and Emily did not lower her weapon until she saw the face of the person in front. It was the boy. Behind him were 4 men she did not recognize, not American military local fighters, the kind of armed network that Farouk maintained and that had been the invisible infrastructure of American intelligence operations in this region for years. And behind them, emerging from the dark with an expression that she would never quite be able to describe, was Major Dennis Hargrove. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her face. Then he looked at Rahman. Then he looked back at her, and she watched something cross his expression that was too complicated for a single word: relief and guilt, and something that might have been awe, though Hargrove would have denied that if asked. Carter, he said. His voice came out rough. Major, she said. She lowered her weapon. Are you? He started the question and then seemed to realize it was inadequate for the situation. How are you? I'm standing, she said. I have the target. I need medical attention for my leg, and I need the intelligence I gathered transmitted to the relevant authority within the next... She looked at her watch. 69 hours. There's a civilian target. I'll brief on the way down. Hargrove stared at her for another full second. Then he did something she did not expect. He said, I'm sorry. She looked at him. The report, he said. The decision. Carter, I should have pushed harder. I had the beacon log. I had Alvarez and Donnelly's account. I should have... Were you the one who decided to extract without confirming casualties? She said. No, he said. Were you the one who filed the report that declared me dead? No. Then we'll have that conversation later, she said. Right now, I need to move this prisoner to secure custody, and I need that intelligence transmitted. Can you help me with that? He straightened. Yes, he said. Good. She looked at the boy. The boy was watching her with weighted, exhausted eyes. She crossed to him and put her hand on his shoulder and felt him exhale a long, shaking exhale, the sound of someone releasing something they had been carrying for a very long time. You did it, she said. You understand that what happened tonight, you are part of that. He looked at her and then looked at Rahman, at the man who had forced his family into service, who had used the people around him as instruments and discarded them when they were no longer useful. And the expression on the boy's face was not triumph. It was quieter than that, deeper than that. It was the expression of someone who has done a thing that cost them something real and who is only now beginning to understand that the cost was worth it. Emily turned back to Hargrove. Let's move, she said. Hargrove looked at Roman, then at Emily. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, something shorter, harder than a laugh. 72 hours ago, he said, the colonel told me you were a liability. Emily picked up her back and checked Rahman's restraints one final time. I was wrong about the math, she said, and she started down the mountain. Behind her, Hargrove gestured to the local fighters who took positions around Rahman. The boy fell in beside Emily, matching her pace, and the group moved down through the dark in the specific ordered silence of people who have completed something that was not supposed to be possible and are now doing the quiet work of carrying it home. The compound behind them was still lit. She could see it from the ridgeline activity, increasing figures moving the belated response of an organization that had just discovered it had been penetrated and relieved of its central figure. Too late, Rahman was already gone. And Emily Carter, who had been declared dead by the people who were supposed to protect her, who had spent 3 days alone in mountains that were designed to kill her, who had walked into a fortress full of armed men and walked back out with the one man her entire unit had spent months trying to reach. Emily Carter was already thinking about what came next. Not the recognition, not the conversation with Whitmore that was now inevitable, not the investigation, the testimony, the institutional reckoning that Hargrove's beacon log and Alvarez's account were already setting in motion. She was thinking about the market, the civilians, the 72-hour countdown that was now going to produce nothing but an ordinary day. People buying things and talking to each other and existing in the unguarded, unaware way that people exist when they don't know what almost happened to them. She thought about that. She thought it was enough. She kept walking. Day 3, 0611 hours. The forward operating base was 38 minutes away when Hargrove got on his radio. Emily heard him making the call. The clipped, careful language of someone who was aware that every word he said was being heard by people above his pay grade and was choosing each one accordingly. He confirmed that he had located the missing asset. He confirmed that the mission objective had been secured. He confirmed that both were ambulatory and being transported to base. He did not say anything else. He clicked off and fell into step beside Emily, and for about 100 meters, neither of them spoke. The local fighters moved ahead with Rahman. The boy walked just behind Emily, quieter now, the adrenaline of the night settling into something heavier and more tired. How much did you tell them? Emily asked. Enough to get a team authorized, Hargrove said. Farouk's contact reached me at 2:30. I had 4 hours to work with. Who authorized the team? A pause. I went around Whitmore, he said. Emily glanced at him. I went to Colonel Reyes at the regional coordination level, Hargrove said. I gave him the beacon log, the accounts from Alvarez and Donnelly, and what the boy told Farouk. He authorized a recovery operation within 20 minutes. Emily was quiet for a moment. Whitmore doesn't know yet, she said. It wasn't a question. He knows now, Hargrove said. Reyes would have notified him when I left the base, which means by the time we arrive, he'll have had 2 hours to prepare, Emily said. Yes, she thought about that. She thought about Whitmore sitting in his office right now, understanding that the report he had written, clean and precise and completely constructed around a version of events that protected him, was about to be confronted with the version that actually happened. She thought about what a man like that did with 2 hours and a problem like that. He would not crumble. He would adapt. He would look for the angle that gave him the most defensible position. He would frame this somehow in some way she couldn't fully anticipate yet as a situation in which his decisions had been reasonable, given the information available, and in which the outcome was due to factors outside his control. She knew that because she knew men like Whitmore. She had been dealing with men like Whitmore for 12 years. Don't let him talk to you before the debrief, she said. Hargrove looked at her. What? Whatever he says to you when we arrive, whatever framing he tries to establish before the formal process starts, don't engage with it. Don't agree, don't argue, don't respond beyond acknowledging that you heard him. Just tell him you'll address everything through the official process. She paused. He's going to try to shape the narrative in the next 2 hours. The only way to stop that is to not participate in it. Hargrove was quiet. You're thinking about this very clearly for someone who hasn't slept in 3 days, he said. I slept 2 hours yesterday morning, she said. That's not... I know. They kept moving. At 0631, the base came into view. Emily had been to this base dozens of times. She knew its layout, its rhythms, its specific daily patterns of activity. She knew what it looked like at 0630 on an ordinary morning, which soldiers would be, where which routines would be running, what the ambient noise level would be. This was not an ordinary morning. The activity at the perimeter was wrong. Too many people, too much deliberate positioning. Personnel who had no operational reason to be at the eastern approach were at the eastern approach, and they were not pretending to be there for any other reason. They were there to see what was coming in. Word had spread. Emily felt it the moment she came through the perimeter checkpoint, the specific quality of attention that a large group of people direct at one person when that person has done something that doesn't fit into their existing understanding of what's possible. It was not a comfortable feeling. It never was. She had experienced versions of it before, and it always made her want to move faster to get through the open space and into an interior where the attention would narrow to something more manageable. She kept her pace steady. She did not look around at the people looking at her. She looked at the building ahead of her, and she kept walking. Hargrove moved with her, and the local fighters handed Rahman off to the security personnel who were waiting a formal, practiced handover that was over in 90 seconds, Rahman disappearing into the custody of people who had been trying to get their hands on him for months and who were not going to let go of that fact. The boy stopped at the perimeter. Emily stopped with him. "What happens to him now?" the boy asked. Meaning Rahman. "He goes somewhere where people ask him questions," she said. "For a long time. And the operation, the market. That intelligence is already moving it," she said. "What you told me, what I observed that's in the system now. The people who need to know." She looked at him. "It's not going to happen." He exhaled, long and slow. "Your family," she said. "You need to get back to them. Farouk will help with that." She paused. "And at some point, someone is going to want to talk to you, officially, about what you saw inside that compound. Is that okay?" He nodded. She extended her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then took it, a firm, serious handshake, the kind that meant something to both of them. "You're a brave person," she said. "I mean that without any qualification." He looked at her with those exhausted, serious eyes. "So are you," he said. She watched him go. Then she turned back toward the base and walked into whatever was waiting for her. Day 3, 0658 hours. What was waiting for her was a medical team first, which she was grateful for, and Colonel James Whitmore second, which she had expected. The medical team worked efficiently. Her leg was examined, cleaned, and properly dressed. She had a hairline fracture in the left fibula. Not the worst outcome given the terrain she had covered in the past 3 days, but enough to explain why every step for the last 12 hours had felt like walking on broken glass. They wanted to admit her for monitoring. She negotiated a compromise, a cot in the medical bay, an IV for rehydration 2 hours before the formal debrief. She was on the cot of running when Whitmore came in. He did not knock on the open door frame. He simply walked in the way he walked into most spaces, as if the right to enter had already been established, and the question of permission was a formality too minor to observe. He stopped at the foot of the cot and looked at her. She looked back at him. She had thought about this moment during the long hours of walking. She had run it in her mind, imagined different versions of it, prepared herself for different approaches he might take. She had thought about what she wanted to say, whether she wanted to say anything, whether silence was more powerful than words. She had decided on something. "Colonel," she said. "Captain Carter," he said. His voice was completely controlled. "It's good to see you alive." She said nothing. The situation was, he stopped, recalibrated. The decisions made during the extraction were based on the information available at that time. Communications were down. The threat level was, "Colonel," she said. He stopped. "I'm not going to have this conversation right now," she said. "Not here, not like this. There's going to be a formal process, and everything that happened will be addressed through that process. I'll say everything I have to say there." Something moved across his face. Not guilt. She had stopped expecting guilt from him. Something more like the recalibration of someone who had expected one kind of conversation and was now adjusting to the reality of a different one. "I think it would be better," he said carefully, "if we had a chance to align on the sequence of events before." "Align on," she repeated. "There are details that are open to interpretation." "Align on," she said again, and this time she let him hear what was underneath the words. Not anger, nothing as simple as anger, but something harder and more final. He stopped talking. "I know what happened," she said. "You know what happened. Alvarez and Donnelly know what happened. Major Hargrove knows what happened. The beacon log knows what happened." She paused. "I spent 3 days in those mountains. I captured the man you spent 8 months trying to reach. I disrupted an attack that would have killed civilians. I did all of that after you declared me dead." The room was very quiet. I am not interested in aligning on anything, she said. I'm interested in telling the truth in the appropriate setting, through the appropriate process, and then I'm interested in sleeping for approximately 15 hours. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without effort. He left. Emily lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling, and she let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of everything that had happened in the past 72 hours. She let it move through her, not suppressed, not processed into something tactical, just felt. The cold and the pain and the loneliness of those mountains. The moment she heard her own name declared dead. Alvarez's face when she came back for him. The boy's voice saying courage. Hargrove's face when he came over the ridge and found her standing there with Rahman's restraints in her hand. She let herself feel all of it. Then she closed her eyes and slept for exactly 92 minutes before the debrief. Day 3, 1024 hours. Colonel Marcus Reyes was not what most people pictured when they pictured the kind of officer who made things happen quietly and quickly in the background of complicated situations. He was 61 years old, slight, with reading glasses he wore on a cord around his neck, and the specific, unhurried manner of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that urgency and speed were not the same thing. He had been in this region for 11 months. He had worked with Emily's unit on 2 previous operations, and she knew him well enough to trust him not unconditionally, but in the particular way that military relationships work, built on demonstrated performance and reliable judgment rather than personal affinity. The debrief room had 6 people in it. Reyes at the head of the table, Hargrove on the left side, 2 intelligence officers whose names Emily registered and filed, a JAG officer, judge advocate, general military legal, whose presence at a mission debrief was significant enough that Emily clocked it the moment she walked in. Whitmore was not in the room. She noted that. She sat down, accepted the water someone put in front of her, and began. She gave them everything. She talked for 90 minutes without notes, pulling from the precise, detailed memory that had been one of her professional tools for 12 years, dates, times, positions, conversations, observations. She described what she had seen in the compound on the night of the original mission. She described the decision to return for Alvarez and Donnelly. She described the extraction in the helicopter in the beacon. She described 3 days in the mountains. She described the boy. She described what he told her. She described the market in the timeline and the specific foreign accent she had heard from the lower-level meeting room. That last detail made both intelligence officers lean forward simultaneously. "You're certain about the accent," one of them said. "Yes," she said. "Can you describe it more specifically?" She did, in detail. The particular phonetic characteristics that had registered in that split second in the quarter filed and retained with the same reliability as everything else. The 2 intelligence officers exchanged a look that told her the accent meant something to them. Something specific, something they already had context for, and she filed that too because it told her the network she had disrupted was larger and more international than she had already suspected. Then Reyes asked her about Whitmore. She told him. All of it. The pre-mission briefing and the question he had refused to engage. The decision to extract, the 4 words on the radio. The report she had not seen but whose existence she had inferred from Hargrove's account. The conversation in the medical bay 2 hours ago. She told it without embellishment, without emotional language, without the kind of framing that advocates rather than reports. She just said what happened. When she finished, this room was quiet for a moment. "Captain Carter," Reyes said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer it directly." "Yes, sir." "In your assessment, and I'm asking for your honest professional assessment, not the answer that's easiest to give in this room, do you believe that Colonel Whitmore's decision to extract and to file the report he filed was a result of error and misjudgment under difficult conditions? Or do you believe it was a deliberate decision made for reasons other than operational necessity?" She sat with the question for a moment. It was the right question. It was also the most consequential question in the room because the answer to it was the difference between a career-ending mistake and something considerably more serious. "I believe," she said carefully, "that the conditions were difficult and that some of the decisions made that night could be attributed to the fog of a failed operation." She paused. "I also believe that the beacon fired after the jamming cleared. I believe that 2 soldiers returned with an account that directly contradicted the casualty report. And I believe that the conversation I just had in which a senior officer suggested that we align on a sequence of events before the formal process was not the language of a man trying to correct an honest error. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. "Thank you, Captain," he said. "That's all we need for now." She stood to leave. Reyes stopped her. "Captain Carter," he said. Something in his tone made her turn around. "The intelligence you gathered, the market, the timeline, the foreign national, that information was transmitted within 40 minutes of your arrival. The relevant authorities have been notified. Operations are being coordinated." She waited. "Those people are going to be safe," he said, "because of what you did out there." She looked at him for a moment. "The boy," she said, "he should be part of that accounting. Not me alone." "He will be," Reyes said. She nodded, and she left. Day 3, 1347 hours. Sergeant Marcus Webb found her on the eastern side of the base, sitting on a low concrete barrier, with her injured legs stretched out in front of her, and a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. He stopped a few feet away from her, and she could see him trying to figure out what to say, cycling through several options, visibly the way young soldiers do when they are confronted with situations that their training did not specifically prepare them for. She helped him out. "Sit down, Webb." He sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The base moved around them at its normal morning pace, as if the last 3 days had not happened, as if the world were continuous and ordinary, which it was, Emily thought, for most of the people on this base. They had experienced a failed mission and a casualty, and then unexpectedly a correction to that casualty. They had processed those things in the way soldiers process operational events, quickly, practically, and then forward. But Webb had been the last person to talk to her before she turned back toward the compound. He had been the one who carried her order, "Fall back, don't wait, go," and had followed it and had been living with that since. "I heard the helicopter leaving," she said. "When I was coming back with Alvarez and Donnelly, I heard it and I knew we weren't going to make it to the extraction point in time." Webb said nothing. "I don't tell you that to make you feel better," she said. "I tell you because I want you to understand that the timeline wasn't your decision. You did exactly what I told you to do." "I know that," he said, and then quieter. "It doesn't help much." "No," she agreed, "it usually doesn't." He looked at his hands. "When they said you were gone," he said, "I went to Whitmore. I told him about the beacon. I told him..." He stopped. He said the situation was closed. She looked at him. "I went back twice," he said. "He stopped letting me in." "I know," she said, and she did know she had not known specifically about Webb, but she knew the shape of it because Webb was exactly the kind of soldier who would have gone back twice and been stopped twice and had to live with that. "Hargrove finally listened," Webb said. "I went to Hargrove the morning of the second day." "I know that too," she said. "If I'd gone to him sooner..." "Webb," she said. He looked up. "You went through your chain of command. You did what you were supposed to do. The failure in this situation is not yours." She let that sit for a moment. "It belongs to the person who made the decision, and that person is going to answer for it. That process has already started." He was quiet for a long moment. "What's going to happen to him?" he asked. "That's not my decision," she said. "And it shouldn't be. That's what processes are for." She picked up her cold coffee, looked at it, set it back down. "What I can tell you is that what happened out there is documented. The beacon log, your accounts, Alvarez and Donnelly, the debrief this morning, all of it is on record. The truth of what happened doesn't go away just because someone tried to bury it." Webb looked at her with the particular expression of someone who wants to believe that and is trying to decide if they can. "Does it always work out that way?" he asked. And the truth, she considered being dishonest with him. Considered giving him the version that was easier to hear. "Not always," she said, "but more often than the people who try to suppress it are counting on. And in this case," she paused, "in this case there are too many people who know too much and too much of it is documented. And there's a captured enemy commander in custody right now who significantly changes the institutional calculus around how this gets handled." He nodded slowly. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "every person on this base knows what you did. Not just last night, the whole 3 days." He looked at her. "People are..." He searched for the word. "They're not going to forget it." She didn't know what to say to that. She usually didn't when people said things like that because she had never entirely figured out how to receive credit for doing what she believed was the only available option. "Go get some sleep, Sergeant," she said. He stood. Then he stopped. "Captain," he said, When Alvarez came in, when he told us what you said, tell them I'm finishing the mission. He paused. I just want you to know, every person who heard that, it changed something. I don't know exactly how to explain it. He stopped again. It's okay, she said. You don't have to explain it. He nodded. He left. Emily sat with her cold coffee and the sounds of the bass and let those words move through her. Tell them I'm finishing the mission. She had said it because it was true. She had not said it for effect, had not calculated the weight it would carry when it arrived at this base before she did. She had said it because, in that moment, it was simply what she was doing, and she had wanted them to know. But she thought about Webb's face saying it changed something, and she thought about what it would mean to a young soldier to hear that someone had been left behind and had kept going anyway. Not because the system supported her, not because she had resources, or backup, or the comfort of knowing someone was coming, but because the mission was real and the people the mission was designed to protect were real, and that was enough. She thought about what it meant, that felt remarkable to them. She thought about all the ways she had spent 12 years being told she was the problem, too cautious, too analytical, too different, too something that required correction by people who were measuring her against a standard she had never agreed to be measured by. And she thought about the market. Ordinary people on an ordinary day, not knowing what had been planned for them, not knowing what had been stopped, not knowing that somewhere in the arithmetic of the last 72 hours their lives had been on one side of the equation and one exhausted, injured, declared dead officer had been on the other side. They would never know her name. She was completely okay with that. Day 3, 1,500 hours. The formal investigation into Colonel James Whitmore's conduct was initiated at 1,500 hours on the 3rd day. Emily was not in the room when it started. She was in the medical bay, finally agreeing to the rest that had been recommended 6 hours ago. Lying flat on a cot with her leg elevated and her eyes closed, not sleeping, but not exactly awake either, floating in the specific liminal state that follows extreme physical and psychological stress, where the body has stopped demanding things and the mind has not yet started up again. She heard about the investigation from Hargrove, who came by at 15:45. He knocked on the doorframe this time. They opened the formal file, he said. I know, she said without opening her eyes. Reyes signed the order himself, he said. He's also escalated the foreign national identification to the counterintelligence division. The accent you described apparently matches an ongoing investigation. They've been looking at a specific network for, don't tell me, she said. He stopped. I'm still inside a debrief process, she said. Anything you tell me now becomes part of what I know, and I don't want to know anything that wasn't established independently before I said it. Keep it clean. He was quiet for a moment. That's very careful of you. That's 12 years of being the person people look for reasons to discredit, she said. You learn to be careful. Another pause. Carter, he said, I owe you more than an apology. I want you to know that I understand that. She opened her eyes. He was standing in the doorway with the expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy and was trying to figure out how to set it down without dropping it on someone. You went around Whitmore when it mattered, she said. You're the reason Reyes got the information in time. You're the reason that team was authorized. You made a choice that had professional consequences for you, and you made it anyway. She looked at him steadily. That counts? He exhaled. It should have been sooner, he said. Yes, she agreed, but it wasn't never, and never would have been worse. He nodded once. Then he said, get some rest. Reyes wants you available tomorrow morning, but not before. Tell Reyes thank you, she said. He'll say he was just doing his job. Tell him anyway, she said, and she closed her eyes again. The bass settled into its evening rhythms around her. Somewhere in a secure holding facility, Khalid Rahman was beginning the long process of answering questions from people who had been waiting a very long time to ask them. Somewhere the intelligence she had carried out of those mountains was moving through the channels that would eventually produce the disruption of the operation and the protection of the market, and a cascade of consequences she would never fully see or know. Somewhere in a quiet house at the foot of a mountain, a 15-year-old boy was home, and somewhere in an office 2 buildings away, Colonel James Whitmore was beginning to understand that the report he had written so cleanly and efficiently 3 nights ago was not going to be the last word on what had happened. It was not going to be the last word at all. Emily Carter lay on her cot with her leg elevated and her eyes closed, and she breathed in and breathed out, and she let the weight of 3 days in the mountains begin slowly and incrementally to lift. She had not done what she did for this moment. She had not done it for the investigation or the accountability or any of the institutional processes that were now in motion. She had done it because the mission was real. Because the people were real. Because walking away from a thing that needed to be done was not something she knew how to do. But she was human and she was tired. And somewhere in the quiet of the medical bay, with the sounds of the bass outside and the IV running in her arm, and the specific bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has asked everything from themselves and had everything to give. Somewhere in all of that, Emily Carter let herself feel the thing she had not let herself feel in 3 days. She felt the relief of being done. She felt the specific, private, completely unceremonious relief of a person who set out to do something impossible and arrived at the other side of it still breathing. No one saw it. No one needed to. It was hers. And then she slept. She woke up knowing something had changed. Not in the room, not in the bass. The bass sounded exactly as it always sounded at 0712, the same patterns of movement, the same ambient frequencies of an installation that never fully slept. The change was internal. Something had shifted during those hours of sleep, some recalibration that her body and mind had conducted without her conscious participation. And what she woke up to was a version of herself that was not the same as the version that had closed her eyes the night before. She was still tired. The leg still hurt. The IV had run its course sometime in the night, and someone had removed it carefully without waking her, which she appreciated. But she was clear. The specific quiet clarity of someone who has come through something and landed on the other side of it with a new understanding of exactly who they are and exactly what they are willing to do and exactly what they are not. She sat up. She put her feet on the floor. She tested the leg functional, painful, manageable. She stood. The medical officer on duty came over immediately with the particular brisk efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "Captain Carter, good morning. How's the pain level?" "Manageable," she said. "I'd like to do a quick assessment before—" "I need 10 minutes first," she said. "Please." He nodded and stepped back, and she found a quiet corner of the medical bay and stood there for exactly 10 minutes, breathing slowly, letting the day settle into her. She thought about what was ahead of her today. Rachel had asked for her availability this morning. That meant more formal process, more questions, more documentation, the methodical institutional machinery of an investigation that was now fully in motion. She would need to be precise and patient and thorough, and she would need to do all of that while being fully aware that somewhere in that same process, a man who had tried to erase her was being forced to account for that attempt. She thought about Whitmore, not with anger. She had examined her anger at Whitmore carefully over the past 3 days, had turned it over, looked at it from multiple angles, assessed it the way she assessed everything, and what she had found was that the anger was real but not primary. Underneath it was something quieter and more serious, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to grief. The specific sadness of watching an institution fail the people it was built to protect because one person inside it had decided that his position mattered more than their lives. She thought about all the soldiers who had never had someone like Hargrove go around the chain, who had been declared lost and stayed lost because no one made the call. She thought about them for a long moment. Then she walked back to the medical officer and said, "I'm ready for the assessment. Day 4, 0914 hours. Colonel Racious had a way of beginning difficult meetings that Emily found genuinely unusual in her experience of senior officers. He began them by saying what he knew, what he didn't know, and what he needed in that order, without preamble, without the kind of institutional performance that turned information exchanges into theater. He did it this morning. "Here is what I know," he said. "The intelligence you provided has been verified by 3 independent sources and acted upon. The civilian target is protected. The foreign national identification you made has opened a significant counterintelligence thread that our people are now pursuing." He paused. "The boy's account has been formally recorded, and his family has been identified for relocation support. Farouk has been compensated at the standard rate, and then some." Emily nodded. "Here is what I don't know," Reyes continued. "The full scope of what Colonel Whitmore knew when he knew it, and what decisions were made with that knowledge. That investigation is ongoing. I don't have conclusions yet, and I won't pretend to." She waited. "Here is what I need," he said. "I need you to understand that this process is going to take time. Institutional investigations, real ones, not the perform kind, take time. And during that time, there will be pressure. Some of it will be directed at you. People who have reasons to want a different outcome will apply that pressure in ways both direct and indirect. He looked at her steadily. I need to know that you understand that and that you are going to remain steady through it. I've been underestimated and pressured by people inside this institution for 12 years, sir, she said. I know how to stay steady. Something moved across Reyes's face, not quite a smile, something more like recognition. I know you do, he said. I'm saying it anyway because you deserve to hear it said out loud. What you did in those mountains is documented, witnessed, and irrefutable. No amount of institutional pressure changes what is in the record, and I will personally ensure that the record is protected. She looked at him. Why, she said. He raised an eyebrow. You didn't have to go around Whitmore, she said. Hargrove came to you, yes, but you could have sent him back through proper channels. You could have told him the report was filed and the situation was closed. A lot of officers at your level would have done exactly that. She paused. So I'm asking why you didn't. Reyes was quiet for a moment. I had a captain once, he said. 12 years ago. Situation that rhymed with this one, not identical, but similar enough. I was a major then. Someone came to me with information that didn't match the official account. He stopped. I sent them back through proper channels. She held his gaze. That captain didn't come home, he said simply. The room was very quiet. I've had 12 years to think about that decision, he said. I made a different one this time. She understood then why he had moved so fast, why the authorization had taken 20 minutes, why he had signed the investigation order himself. It was not policy or procedure or institutional obligation. It was a 12-year-old debt he was finally paying. She didn't say any of that out loud. Thank you, sir, she said. He nodded once. Then he opened the folder in front of him and they went back to work. Day 4, 1130 hours. The twist came at 11:30 and it came from a direction Emily had not anticipated. She was finishing her second session with the intelligence officers, adding detail to the foreign national identification, walking through specific phonetic characteristics for the third time as they cross-referenced against existing intelligence when one of them set down his pen and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has just made a decision about how much to say. Captain Carter, he said, I want to share something with you, not as part of the formal debrief, but because I think you have earned the right to understand what you walked into. She waited. The operation you disrupted, he said, was not a standalone event. It was the culminating action of an 18-month coordination between Rahman's network and an external partner organization operating out of a third country. Foreign national you heard in that room, the voice you identified is someone we have been tracking for 14 months. She processed this. The market attack was not the objective, he continued. It was the opening move. It was designed to create a specific response, a military response in a specific sector that would have served as a diversion for a second operation 200 kilometers away. An operation against a significantly harder target. He paused. We were not aware of the second operation until your intelligence gave us the thread to pull. Emily sat very still. The market was bait, she said. Yes. They wanted the military response. Yes, they had planned for it, accounted for it. He looked at her. If the market attack had proceeded, and if we had responded the way they expected us to respond, the second operation would have had approximately a 90-minute window of opportunity with reduced coverage. She worked through the implications. It did not take long. What was the second target, she asked. He told her. She did not let herself react visibly. But she sat with it, the full weight of what that second target meant, the scale of what had been planned, the months of coordination and preparation that had gone into building something this intricate, and she understood something she had not fully understood before. She had not been completing a mission. She had been dismantling an architecture. 3 days alone in those mountains, working from what she could see and remember and infer, she had pulled on a thread without knowing how far it extended. She had captured one man, the visible named mission objective, without knowing that the removal of that man from that fortress at that specific moment would unravel the timing and coordination of something vastly larger than the capture of one enemy commander. She had not known. She had done it anyway, had done it for the reasons she always acted, which were immediate and human and uncomplicated because people were going to be hurt. And she was the only person in a position to stop that. And it had turned out to be so much bigger than she knew. Captain Carter, the intelligence officer, said. His voice was careful and precise. I want to be direct with you. What you did in those 72 hours working alone, without support or communication on incomplete information, produced an intelligence result that a full team operation planned and resourced and executed under normal conditions might not have achieved. He paused. Because a full team operation would have been anticipated, it would have moved in a pattern that could be read and predicted. You moved in a pattern that was completely unpredictable because it was not a pattern at all. It was one person responding to real conditions in real time. She looked at him. I'm telling you this, he said, because I think you should know the full scope of what you walked into and what you walked out with. Not for the record, not for the investigation. He held her gaze. Because you deserve to understand what you actually did. She sat with that for a long moment. The boy, she said, he was the first piece of information that changed my assessment of the scope. He told me about the planners in that lower room. Without him, I might have attempted a simple intelligence extraction and missed the larger picture entirely. We know, he said. His contribution is fully documented. Make sure it stays that way, she said. It will. She nodded. And she sat back, and she breathed, and she let the full shape of the last 3 days settle into a new configuration, larger than she had built, it deeper than she had understood, and she felt something that was difficult to name. Not pride exactly, something more like the particular solemnity of understanding that the things you do when you believe no one is watching, when there is no recognition available, no reward in sight, no audience for the choice, those things can still matter at a scale that you will never fully see. She had made every decision in those mountains because it was the right thing to do, and it had turned out to matter in ways she could not have calculated. That was not a lesson she needed. She had already known it. But it was something else to have it confirmed at this scale by evidence, this specific and this large. She felt it, and then she filed it, and she stood up, and she went back to work. Day 4, 1500 hours. The call from her family came at 1500. She had been fielding communications since the morning her unit back home had been notified that her status had changed from killed in action to active and recovering, and the wave of incoming messages that had followed that notification was the kind of thing that required management. Her mother called first. Emily sat in a quiet room off the medical bay with her phone in her hand, and when her mother's voice came through, it did something to her that nothing else in the past 72 hours had done. It broke through every layer of professional composure and tactical discipline and trained emotional management and reached the place underneath all of that, the place that was just a person, just a daughter, just someone who had been very close to never coming home. Her mother did not say anything dramatic. That was not her style. She said, I knew they were wrong. And Emily said, Mom. And her mother said, I knew it. I kept telling your father, I said they're wrong. She's not gone. I know it. Emily pressed her hand over her eyes and breathed carefully. I'm here, she said. I know you're here, her mother said, and her voice was steady and fierce, and Emily had never loved her more. I've known you were here. Her father came on a moment later. He was a quieter man, had been a quieter man her entire life, the kind of father who communicated primarily through presence and action, in small, precise gestures of care. He said, good work, kiddo. She laughed. Actually laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised her. Thanks, Dad. Come home when you can. I will. Not before you're ready. I know, but don't take too long. She stayed on the call for 20 minutes. When she hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand for a while, and she let herself be for just those few minutes, not Captain Carter, not the officer who had spent 3 days in the mountains, not the subject of an investigation or a debrief or an institutional reckoning. Just their daughter, still alive, still here. It mattered. It mattered enormously, and she let it matter, and then she put the phone down and walked back into the day. 3 weeks later, the formal findings of the investigation were released on a Thursday morning, and Emily was sitting in Reyes's office when he read them to her directly. Whitmore had been relieved of command, not quietly, not in the soft institution protecting way that bad decisions by senior officers were so often handled, wrapped in euphemism, and processed through obscure administrative mechanisms that left the record technically clean. He had been formally relieved pending a full court-martial review on 2 counts: dereliction of duty and failing to mount a recovery operation when evidence confirmed a soldier was alive in the field, and conduct unbecoming in the conversation he had with Emily in the medical bay, the documented witnessed attempt to align on a sequence of events before the formal process. Hargrove had provided a formal statement. Alvarez and Donnelly had provided formal statements. Webb had provided a formal statement. The beacon log was entered into the record. The medical officer who had been present during Whitmore's visit to the bay had provided a formal statement. The record was thorough. It was precise. It was, as Emily had told Alvarez in the dark of those mountains, very difficult to suppress when too many people knew too much of it. She listened to Reyes read through the findings without interrupting. When he finished, he looked at her over his reading glasses. "Do you have questions?" he said. "No," she said. "Is there anything you need from me regarding the findings?" "Nothing that isn't already in the record," he said. She nodded. "How do you feel about the outcome?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "I feel like the institution worked," she said, "slowly and imperfectly, and only because specific people made specific choices to push it in the right direction. But it worked." She paused. "I feel like that matters, and I feel like it's not enough at the same time." Reyes looked at her for a long moment. "That's the most accurate description of institutional accountability I've ever heard," he said. She almost smiled. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends," he said, "on what you want." She looked at him. "You have options, Captain Carter," he said. "The standard path forward, given what you've just been through, medical leave reassignment time. But there are also significant people with significant resources and significant reach, who have a very clear picture of what you're capable of and who would like to talk to you about a different kind of role." "What kind of role?" she said. "The kind," he said carefully, "where the decisions that got made in this situation, the decisions about who to send what information to trust, how to weigh risk against institutional convenience, are made differently. Where someone who understands from personal and direct experience what the cost of those decisions actually looks like is part of the conversation." She sat with that. She thought about the question Reyes had asked her weeks ago, whether she could stay steady through pressure. She thought about Webb's face saying it changed something. She thought about the intelligence officer telling her what she had actually disrupted. She thought about Alvarez's voice saying, "You came back for us," with genuine shock. She thought about 12 years of being told she was the problem, and the specific clarifying experience of being told she was dead and deciding that was not the last word on the matter. "Tell me more," she said. 2 months later, the room where Emily Carter stood was large and quiet and full of people who were used to being the most accomplished person in any given space. Senior officers, intelligence professionals, people who had spent careers at the intersection of policy and field reality, people who made decisions that had consequences. She understood intimately because she had lived on the receiving end of those consequences. She had been asked to speak, not about the mission specifically. The specific operational details were still classified, would remain classified, were not hers to share in a setting like this. She had been asked to speak about something broader, about leadership, about what it meant, about what it cost when it was done badly and what it produced when it was done well. She stood in front of them and she thought about what she wanted to say. She had prepared remarks. She had sat with them for 2 evenings and written them carefully the way she did everything carefully, and they were precise and measured and completely accurate. She set them aside. "I was declared dead," she said, "not because I was dead, because it was convenient for someone's report that I was dead." She paused. "I want to start there because I think everything else I'm going to say only makes sense if you understand that the decisions we make about people, the decisions about who is expendable and who is not, about whose survival is worth the cost of the effort, those decisions have real human beings attached to them. And those human beings are still alive to be affected by them, even when we've decided otherwise." The room was very still. "There was a soldier in my unit," she said, "who was genuinely shocked when I came back for him. He said you came back for us as a question almost, as if it were something he had not expected, as if the act of returning for your own people were somehow above and beyond what the situation called for." She paused. "That is a leadership failure, not his. The system that produced that expectation, the environment in which a soldier had learned to be surprised by basic acts of commitment from the people responsible for him, that is a leadership failure at a scale that is worth taking seriously. She looked out at the room, at the senior officers, at the people with the rank and the resources and the decision-making authority. The mission I completed in those mountains was not remarkable because of what I did, she said. I want to be clear about that. What I did was exactly what the mission required. What was remarkable was that I had to do it alone. What was remarkable was that the system designed to support me had actively failed me before I ever started. What was remarkable was that a 15-year-old boy who lived near that compound showed more unconditional commitment to the outcome of that mission than the senior officer responsible for it. A pause. That boy is not in this room, she said. He will never be in a room like this. He does not have rank or title or institutional standing. What he has is the decision he made in the dark in a place where it cost him something real when no one was watching and no reward was available. She let that sit. I want to suggest to everyone in this room that the standard he set is the one worth measuring ourselves against. The silence in the room was different now. Not the polite quiet of an audience being professionally attentive. Something heavier and more personal. She went on. She talked about the beacon log, about what it meant that the record of her survival had been documented, preserved by one person who made a choice to keep it when the institutional pressure was to let it go. She talked about the cascade of decisions that had followed that one choice: Hargrove going to Reyes, moving in 20 minutes, the recovery operation that had found her on that ridge with Rahman's restraints in her hand. She talked about how each of those decisions had been made by one person in a specific moment, under specific pressure, and how the difference between the outcome that happened and the outcome that almost happened was the sum of those individual choices. Leadership is not a position, she said. It is a practice. It is what you do in the specific moment when the institutional incentive is pointing one direction and the right thing is pointing another. And the practice either holds or it doesn't. There is no middle ground in the moment. You either go back for your people or you don't. You either file the accurate report or you don't. You either make the call or you don't. She looked at the room one more time. I did not spend 3 days in those mountains because I am exceptional, she said. I spent 3 days in those mountains because someone decided I was disposable and I disagreed. That is all. I disagreed. And I kept moving until the disagreement was resolved. A pause. That option, disagreeing and moving, is available to every person in this room. In your specific role, with your specific authority, in the specific moments that are going to come for all of you, where the report can be filed 2 ways and the decision can go either direction. That option is always available. She paused one final time. The question is whether you take it. She stepped back. The applause started slowly and then built, not the polite rhythmic applause of an audience going through emotion, but something that carried actual weight, that sounded different from the ordinary kind. Emily stood through it and did not look at the room because she was not doing this for their reaction. She had not done any of it for their reaction. She was thinking about Alvarez, about his daughter whose name she still remembered, about whether he was home yet, whether he had held her yet, whether the look on his face when she had come back for him in that compound had faded, or whether it was still there, changed by what came after, converted into something that would inform every decision he made as a soldier going forward. She hoped it had. She hoped that was the thing that lasted. 6 months later, Major Dennis Hargrove was reassigned to a new unit, a better unit, a more appropriate unit, a posting that reflected his actual capability rather than his proximity to a man who had found his judgment inconvenient. He called Emily when the orders came through. I wanted you to know, he said. I heard, she said. Congratulations. I didn't do this for, I know why you did it, she said. It doesn't make it less right that it worked out this way. He was quiet for a moment. Are you okay, he asked. Actually okay, not just actually okay, she said. I'm working on something that matters. She paused. That helps? Good on, he said. And then Carter, for what it's worth, I'm glad you disagreed. She understood what he meant. Me too, she said. Sergeant Marcus Webb was promoted ahead of his peer group, a decision made at a level above his immediate chain noted in his file as recognition of exceptional conduct under adverse operational conditions. He sent Emily a message when he found out. It was short, which was right. He was not a person who said things at length when a few words would carry the weight. The message said, "I understand now why you went back." She read it twice. She did not respond immediately. She sat with it for a while, turning it over, feeling the particular weight of being understood by someone who had been there, who had seen the choice and lived in the uncertainty of its aftermath, and arrived on the other side of all of that at understanding. Then she wrote back, "So do you." 3 words. Enough. Private First Class Alvarez came home on a Thursday evening in late autumn. His daughter was 8 months old and had never met him. His wife had been managing alone since before the deployment, and then through the worst 10 days of her life, when the notification came that he was wounded in action, and then through the 3 days of uncertainty that followed, and then through the long weeks of recovery. He sent Emily one message from the airport before he even left the terminal. The message was a photograph, him, his wife, their daughter held between them, all 3 of them looking at the camera in the specific, unguarded way of people who have been afraid of something for a very long time and have finally allowed themselves to stop. Emily looked at that photograph for a long time. She thought about the compound, the crossfire, pulling him up with one arm while she held her weapon with the other. The thing he had said in the dark, "You came back for us," and the way it had sounded. The surprise in it, the genuine, unguarded surprise of a person who had not expected to be worth returning for. She looked at the photograph and she understood with a clarity that was quiet and complete that the entire 3 days, every step, every decision, every moment of pain and cold and solitude, the fractured leg and the exhausted body and the name filed under fallen in action, all of it, every piece of it had been for this. Not for the investigation, not for the institutional accountability, not for the speech or the posting or any of the things that had come afterward, for this photograph. For a man holding his daughter in an airport on a Thursday evening alive because someone decided that walking away was not something she knew how to do. She saved the photograph. She did not write back immediately. She sat with it and she breathed and she let it be what it was, which was everything. Then she put her phone down and went back to the work that was still ahead of her. Because Emily Carter had never confused a mission being complete with the work being done. The work was always still ahead, and she had always been the kind of person who kept moving toward it, not because someone was watching, not because the institution required it, not because the reward was clear or the recognition was guaranteed or the path was safe, but because the people at the other end of the work were real, and real was always reason enough.